Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining our UQ ChangeMakers webinar series. I'm your host, Anita Heiss, author and Professor of Communications here at the University of Queensland. These are very special events with equally special guests that include you, alumni from around the globe, and of course our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Debbie Terry, and her guests, as well as leading UQ academics. They're all here to talk about the trending issues that are important to you. Welcome everyone to our second ChangeMaker event of 2021, the Pacific White Matters. On behalf of UQ, I'd like to say in my own Wiradjuri language, Marangyeria, Yinjamaradu, Mianjingu, Maingu. Good evening. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of country and caretakers of country here in Mianjin, Brisbane, where I'm speaking to you from tonight. I'm excited to say we are joined this evening by 809 people from 55 countries around the world. Now on to this evening's discussion. We're joined tonight by our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Debbie Terry AO, and three of our expert alumni to unpack why the Pacific is such an important region, not only for Australia, but for the world. A stable and prosperous Pacific has been identified as one of Australia's top foreign policy priorities for years. However, for many Australians, the reasons behind this position are not always well understood. Tonight, our panellists will be unpacking those reasons, addressing why our Pacific neighbours are so important and some of the biggest threats and tensions currently felt in the region. We'll be speaking on the pressures of COVID-19 and climate change and their impacts in the Pacific, as well as the implications of geopolitical frictions playing out in the region. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening. We will be hearing first from UQ's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Debbie Terry AO. Debbie is currently a Fellow and past President of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, as well as an appointed member of the ARC Advisory Council, amongst other roles. Debbie began her distinguished career at UQ in 1990 and rejoined us in 2020. Our panellists this evening are UQ alumni Adjunct Professor Ian Kemish AM, Coral Passisi and Anne Sherry AO. Ian Kemish AM is a former senior Australian diplomat. Among other roles with DFAT, he served as High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, Ambassador to Germany and an international advisor to the Prime Minister. He went on to senior private sector roles and now works independently across the business and philanthropic sectors. His current Pacific-facing roles include Regional Representative for the Global Partnership for Education and Chair of the Kokoda Track Foundation. Coral Passisi is the current Senior Advisor to the Director General of the Pacific Community. She has over 20 years of professional experience in the Pacific region, addressing issues across sustainable development, climate change, climate financing, climate security and Pacific regionalism. Across her career, she has run her own consultancy business and briefed the UN Security Council on climate security and impacts in the Pacific region. She's a great believer in the value of combining Indigenous and modern science to inform decision-making and policy development. Anne Sherry AO is one of Australia's leading business executives with a career spanning government, banking and tourism. She is currently the chair of UNICEF Australia and NRO Group and holds numerous non-executive roles. She's the former Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Carnival Australia, the largest cruise ship operator in the Australia-Pacific region. And in 2015 was the winner of the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence Award. First, we'll hear from our Vice-Chancellor, Debbie. Over to you.
Thank you, Anita. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. We honour their elders and their continuing cultural and spiritual connection to this land as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. It's wonderful to be here for this important discussion about the future of the island nations and communities of the Pacific Ocean. We've had over 800 alumni register for this ChangeMakers webinar from 55 nations scattered all over the globe. So it's brilliant to see that our UQ alumni community is genuinely engaged in the issues that are affecting the Pacific. I'd particularly like to extend a warm welcome to our alumni in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Western Samoa, Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands who have tuned in to this webcast. I'm very proud to say that UQ has a long and rich history of engaging in the Pacific across our education, research and development programs. In fact, I can confidently say that UQ is widely recognised as a leader in this area. We have a deep-rooted connection to the region that's built on both geographic proximity and cultural familiarity with the Pacific. We also have a strong and vibrant Pacific Islander community here that adds a unique flavour to the cultural diversity of Brisbane and Queensland. And of course, Brisbane, along with Auckland, are the two main international gateways to the Pacific. So here in Queensland, we do have a sense that the Pacific is literally in our neighbourhood. And that proximity has been a key factor in building the deep engagement that UQ has enjoyed in the Pacific over many decades. We have particularly strong partnerships with Pacific nations in areas like environmental and marine sciences. But we also have close ties in a range of other areas. For instance, UQ's Emeritus Professor Clive Moore has dedicated his entire career to understanding and explaining the history of Australians' relationship with the Pacific Islands. He's written extensively about the region, and in the process he has become one of the world's foremost experts on Pacific Island history. UQ's deep links in the region also include an alumni network of almost 2,000 graduates scattered across the Pacific. Many of our graduates have gone on to hold very senior leadership roles in their nations, including the current President of Kiribati, Tanitu Mamu, and the former Deputy Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, Charles Abel. At UQ, we also have a proud history of partnering with Pacific Island nations on a rich array of development programs. I can vividly recall meeting with a very senior contingent of government leaders from PNG who visited UQ in the 1990s when I was an academic in the School of Psychology. More recently, UQ has been involved in management training programs for fisheries leaders across the Pacific, a review of gender equity and inclusion policies for the government of Papua New Guinea, and a program for leaders in Fiji and the Solomon Islands that explored how environmental factors, including climate change, should be incorporated into infrastructure planning. These are just a few of many examples. Over the past 5 years, more than 1,800 people from across the Pacific have participated in projects that have been run by UQ's International Development Team. While the programs are varied in scope, they all have one thing in common. They are designed to build the capacity of people to contribute to the sustainable development of their own local community or their nation. As a university, we're very proud of that impact, but we intend to do more. We've recently released our first ever Global Development Impact Plan. That plan sets out our ambition to become the go-to Australian institution for development expertise and impact, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. It's a goal that's entirely consistent with our mission as a university, which is focused on genuinely making a difference, helping to solve our shared global challenges and enriching communities all over the world. Events like this are another important way that UQ is contributing to raising awareness about the issues, challenges and opportunities in the Pacific. As you'll see, we have a wonderful panel of UQ alumni this evening who have had very diverse experiences of living and working in the Pacific. So it should be a fascinating session. I'll now hand back to Anita to get that discussion underway. Thank you.
And thank you for opening this evening's conversation, Debbie. The first thing I'd like to discuss with everyone is that there's a clear question reflected in the title of this session. I would like to put it bluntly to each of you. Why should we, as Australians, as Queenslanders, care about the Pacific region? Ian, would you like to start?
Thanks so much, Anita, and thank you so much for having me. I don't want to sound too much like a real estate agent, but I'd like to start by talking about location. The Pacific laps the shores of this state of Queensland, and Brisbane is a transport gateway to the many countries of the region. We have such a huge state that here in Queensland, the capitals of the various countries of the Melanesian chain are actually closer than many parts of Queensland itself. We don't entirely appreciate that. We have such a strong sense of connection historically with the region as well. We can take no pride in the way South Sea Islanders were pressed into labour in colonial Queensland, and yet their descendants enrich our communities today. We administered the Pacific's largest country, Papua New Guinea, until 1975. And indeed a chancellor of this university, the very first chancellor of this university, was a former lieutenant governor of New Guinea. There's this whole generation of Australians who have strong personal connections with the Pacific. I'm one of them. I grew up in Papua New Guinea. I returned there as an adult, and my life is woven through the region. But I'm a member of a much larger tribe which has this connectivity with the Pacific. And yet, the paradox is that for so many Australians, the Pacific is a blind spot. It's a region we fly over on the way to somewhere else. It's a place which deserves a lot more attention. We are very familiar, for example, with cultural and political developments in the UK and the United States, and yet there are some Australians who would struggle to name the countries of the Pacific. As a former Australian Pacific Islander minister, used to be fond of pointing out television programs with significant audiences in places like the Pacific don't even show the city of Port Moresby on their weather maps. Television programs like the ABC Queensland and the Today Show. It's a shame. It's a great shame that there is this disconnect on the part of so many in society, because actually there are deep pockets of expertise in Australia about the Pacific, and the University of Queensland is one of them. In the end, there are such significant humanitarian imperatives in the region, but it doesn't take being a rocket scientist to understand that the success of this region is good for Australia too. The future of the region rests on a collective approach to its demographic, developmental and climate change future.
Thank you, Ian, for highlighting that historical, cultural and geographical connectivity that we have with the region. Coral, can I ask you now your thoughts on why, as Australians and why Queenslanders should be concerned about and care about the Pacific region?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me join your your esteemed panel today. It's a real pleasure. Well, I think as Ian's outlined really well, it's pretty hard to care about something that you don't know a lot about. So a good first step is always to learn a bit more about the region. It's always good to know who's in your backyard and what they're up to. So I'll just talk a little bit maybe about some of the things that we have in common and some of the common challenges, which will draw sort of some natural reasons around why that's important. So what do we have in common? Our region is a vast blue Pacific continent, 96% ocean and 4% land. Collectively, our 24 countries and territories, including Australia, are sprawled across the region and have jurisdictional responsibility of a combined 30% of the world's exclusive economic zones. This is a huge, contiguous, shared blue real estate. So this is a large part of the world's blue lung, providing half of the oxygen required for our existence. We produce over half the world's tuna supply and manage the only remaining sustainably harvested tuna stocks left in the world. We share the governance of this great resource as well as the responsibility of ensuring its health and longevity. Its integrity underpins planetary and our own country's sustainability and the livelihoods and security of our combined populations and a great many more. So what we take out or put in is going to affect those upstream and downstream, and every contribution and withdrawal that we make of this great resource is part of the sum of the whole of its integrity. So what are the challenges that we're facing together? Global warming, pollution and overharvesting are exceeding the ocean's capability of recovery. Its ecosystem services, which we all enjoy for free, are declining at a rate that has already exceeded the resilience of many of our people and communities. This is transpiring in droughts, wildfires, cyclones, coral reef degradation, declining fisheries habitats, as well as the growth of invasive and zoonotic diseases. Some of these things we may be able to adapt to and build resilience to, but we are already and will continue to face more loss and damage, all of us, Australians and Pacific Islanders. Our ocean is also a major highway for global trade and requires considerable collective capability to monitor, control and facilitate enforcement. So this is true of resource management as it is of security challenges, including drugs, arms and people trafficking. So the short answer is we have to work together. There is no choice. We have to address all of these challenges together and share and manage this shared resource. Even with our combined capabilities and resources, we may still fall short of addressing these challenges. But without our collective effort, we will certainly have very little chance of success. Thank you.
Thank you, Coral, for highlighting the challenges that we share as Australians, but also Pacific Islanders. Very thought-provoking. And I'm going to ask you now what your thoughts are on the topic.
Thank you, and thanks for having me tonight. I come to you from Gadigal country, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging on the lands upon which I am currently sitting. So, look, I think the previous two speakers have covered lots of the areas. So, I was going to talk about proximity. We've talked about real estate. But I guess proximity it's partly about real estate, but it's also about our collective responsibility for the region, which Coral's picked up so eloquently as well. We share the sea, we share the reefs, we share the amazing natural resources of the Pacific collectively. And unless we think about how we manage that in a more collective way, Australia by itself, each of the Pacific countries by themselves will not be able to have the impact that we should have as a united collective, if you like an EU of the South Pacific, thinking more about our collective asset base, our collective responsibility. So I think proximity has a number of dimensions. It's also interesting, I lived in New Zealand for quite a few years, and of course Pacific and New Zealand has quite a different dynamic. In New Zealand, Pacifica communities are valued, talked about a lot, and their relationship to the Pacific, to their home countries, is leveraged very significantly, which we tend not to do here. So we talk about proximity, but we don't celebrate the connectivity that we have with Pacifica communities in Queensland or the rest of Australia in the same way as I've seen that work in New Zealand. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I think our collective history, others have spoken about as well. We just don't know enough about our collective history. It has some elements, I think, of our, lack of real knowledge of our own Indigenous histories as well. But there is a dynamic around that history that if we understood it better, we'd probably value the relationships in a different way. And to some extent, the only real history that's drawn through tends to be Second World War history, which, is one important piece of history with the Solomons, with PNG, with other parts of the Pacific. But there's more history that we should be celebrating because our collective well-being actually comes from shared history in many cases. Obviously, our climate and environmental challenges are common. If the Pacific fails from an environmental, as a result of not managing climate change well in any part of our region, we will all suffer. The decline and the issues that are being talked about currently experienced with the barrier reef are common to reefs across the Pacific. And those issues we should find collective solutions to, because you really can't manage point solutions for those sorts of systemic problems that sit in our collective backyard. And I think the final piece that hasn't been picked up as much is that we've got a lot of business connectivity. We've got tourism businesses. The GDP of many of our near Pacific neighbours, up to 70 to 80% of GDP comes from tourism, primarily from Australia and New Zealand. And so that connectivity is very important and powerful. There's a lot of labour movement that comes from the Pacific to Australia. And so, a lot of our agricultural industries, particularly in Queensland, rely on Pacific labour movement for fruit picking and other seasonal work. But there's lots and lots of business connectivity between Australia and our Pacific region neighbours. And I don't think we talk about that very much either. We don't celebrate it enough. And there's a lot more we could do to, I think, anchor that in the psyche probably of Queensland and Australia.
Thank you, Anne. I like how you're talking about celebrating connectivity and to start thinking with a mindset of being the EU of the South Pacific. Lots of thought-provoking and helpful responses there, so thank you, everyone. We need to move on, though, and one of the few times the Pacific has made headlines in Australia was during COVID-19 outbreaks in the region, and Australians suddenly seem to remember how close we are to our Pacific neighbours. Ian and Anne, based on your experiences working between Australia and the region, what impact has the pandemic had in the Pacific and how has Australia responded? Ian, I'll go to you first.
Sure. Yes, I really did have a strong sense of irony when the Australian media rediscovered just how close Papua New Guinea was when there was a perception that the COVID outbreak there might spread into Northern Australia. Anne in particular is a real expert on this, but I'd just say that broadly across the region, in terms of the health consequences, the experience has been varied. Countries like Papua New Guinea and Fiji have had quite serious encounters with COVID, and they have responded in different ways. But taking a step back and thinking about the region more generally, it's very vulnerable to the economic collateral damage that flows from the pandemic. The World Bank says that collectively the Pacific Island economies have seen a reduction of about 11% over the course of the last year, and they predict quite serious trouble ahead. Now, to your question, look, I personally think Australia has responded pretty well to the needs of the Pacific through this emergency phase, but I do think that very deliberate thought needs to be dedicated now to the longer term consequences of COVID in the region. There is, for example, a looming crisis of education for the region. We've seen, according to a range of surveys, about 70% of girls across the region have reduced time in their studies across the region. There are some suggestions that in the course of this year 1.2 million fewer girls across the Pacific will be attending school. That obviously has quite serious long-term ramifications for the countries of the region, and it's something that we really need to start focusing on now. I guess my point is there has been this emergency health phase, but there's plenty more to come, and Australia will need to stand by the region.
Some very disturbing numbers there, Ian. And what are your thoughts on the impact of COVID in the Pacific and our response?
I think, yes, I think as Ian said, there's a number of lenses through which we can view this. Wearing my UNICEF hat, we pulled together an alliance of governments and actually corporations to start to accelerate access to funding for and the rollout of vaccines across the Pacific. And that's really, I guess, an important first step, because we started in the last 12 months, or the previous 12 months, the Pacific looked like it had managed COVID extremely well. But in the last 6 months, we've had very significant outbreaks, obviously in PNG, but also in Fiji. And I think those outbreaks show the cracks in other elements of the operation of some of those countries. I mean, obviously kids not being able to go to school. There are food shortages now in Fiji in some areas, and there's been violence as a result of that. In PNG, we've seen a lot of vaccine hesitancy as well, and I'll come back to that. But the government, the Australian government, actually has been very supportive of the rollout of the availability of vaccines, and we've been getting community health workers that are used for other vaccination programs in the region to be the front line, if you like, for the COVID rollout, because they're already trusted. They're part of communities, and they can give messages in ways that aid agencies and others can't. So we're using the feet that are already on the ground in all of those countries to try and get vaccines out to communities. But I think post-COVID, or whatever that is, post the current round of vaccines, we do have a lot of other issues. It's shown, as Ian said, some of the development issues we've been leading into for the last few years, including girls' education, access to more services for girls in the Pacific, has taken a big step back in the various lockdowns that have been happening. Closing of schools and so on has impacted girls more significantly than it has boys. All care in families ends up falling on women and girls as well. So as relatives have become sick, girls and women tend to be pulled out of jobs and school to manage those issues in families. So that's obviously a matter that we'll need to lean into again as this current health crisis passes. But I also think it's obviously shown cracks in the health systems in many of our near neighbours, and I think that's been an issue that's been on the agenda for quite some time. But it really, when a health crisis like this hits, you suddenly realise that there's lack of access to PPE equipment, masks, gloves, all the things that we would take for granted in health systems in our part of the world. People haven't been able to take for granted in many parts of the Pacific. So those issues have been the subject of emergency aid drops and all sorts of action to try and deal with it. But I think the other thing I'd say about COVID is that while in our communities we've got quite high tolerance of people on social media saying outrageous things really about vaccination and other things that they clearly believe through social media. We should never forget that social media is a global phenomenon. And some of the vaccine hesitancy we're seeing in our near neighbours comes from the messaging and the languaging of social media that we tolerate. And I often say to people that when you live in a developed country, you have the freedom to say whatever you like and decide whatever you want in your health system, because actually you've got a health system that will pick you up, even if what you say is nonsense, and not being vaccinated has impact. In many of the countries that are near to us, those messages have a much more significant impact, and people don't have systems that pick them up nevertheless. So I just think there's something about a collective responsibility that we have, not just in our own communities, but also for people who listen to the things that we say. And I've had health workers say to me, people in my community say, if you don't want to take the vaccine in Australia, why would we want to take it here? And I just think we lose sight sometimes of the impact of the casualness of some of the comments that we've seen and the campaigns that we've seen on social media, which in fact have very significant impacts in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Anne. So you've both just mentioned the pandemic has highlighted a number of major vulnerabilities and issues in the Pacific, but beyond the pandemic, one of the other key vulnerabilities facing the region is climate change and its impact on local economies, livelihoods and security. Coral, as someone who has spent her career working in this space, what are the real implications of climate change in the Pacific?
Yeah, well, thank you for that important question. I mean, Pacific leaders have since 2009, stated in their annual communique that climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security and well-being of Pacific people. And as we mentioned earlier, we're facing some pretty dire climate change projections in the region, and these are manifesting in many different ways, and the combination of which is very troubling on many different levels. So I'm going to highlight a few of those in the interest of time, and these are some of the ones that I've been working on in the climate security space over the last few years. So the first one is jurisdictional certainty and the threats to the EEZs and those boundary integrities in the region. So as you know, probably base points from which these boundaries are measured are often made up of vulnerable features like shoals and small sandy keys. And these are obviously vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which provides for the establishment of EEZs, didn't foresee climate change or these impacts potentially on those EEZs. And so there is a level of uncertainty around whether countries might lose their EEZs as those base points are eroded, or in fact their entire nation. And of course there cannot be any greater threat than the potential loss of one's entire nation or jurisdiction as established under international law. So Pacific leaders themselves are leading a very strong charge to ensure that the integrity of EEZs, once established and registered under UNCLOS, cannot be challenged as a result of climate change. The second big one is around food security and the productivity of Pacific people. So long before islands go under the ocean, they become so unproductive that they can't sustain livelihoods or life. And this is due to saltwater intrusion, coastal erosion and a number of other impacts. So that once healthy and often free coastal food source, which over 50% of Pacific communities rely on for food and livelihoods, can no longer provide the required levels of abundance of resource for that purpose. And against that backdrop, we have some of the highest non-communicable disease rates in the world. So this will put immense pressure on communities and countries to find alternative healthy food sources. And the productivity of our people will drop and the health and social systems will come under immense strain. And you can, hearing from Anne and Ian around, how much COVID has already set back those challenges and strains in the health system mean that, there's a bit of a triple whammy that we face with climate change, COVID, and the recovery potential for the region. So another big area is around the impact it will have on our blue economy. So a huge portion of our countries derive a significant portion of their revenues, their government revenues, from the sale of tuna fishing licenses in the region. And climate change threatens the migratory paths of these stocks, moving them further eastwards and up into the high seas, where ironically the countries that are producing the most greenhouse gases will haul them out of the water for free. And also within 15 years, it's predicted that 25% of the fish currently consumed by Pacific people will need to be supplemented by those tuna stocks because of the deterioration of coastal fisheries and other food sources as a result of climate change. The fourth area is around the increased frequency and intensity of disasters, and I don't need to say too much on this. This is an area that Australia is very familiar and Queensland's very familiar with. But our island countries are amongst the most exposed and in the world, and the least insured to these impacts. Less than 10% insurance coverage exists in the region, and that's only in a couple of countries. So the capacity to respond to compounding impacts of climate change is very limited. And every event sends states further into debt, and those debt levels are increasing, and many have doubled as a result of COVID in the last year. So we have loss of life, loss of property, and we're creating enabling environments for civil unrest, violence, and this will undermine peace and security in many of our countries, which we take for granted are peaceful nations. And finally, displacement and forced migration. Now, this is already happening across the region. Fiji's documented well over 85 cases, and there are many others, but they just aren't well documented. And most countries do not have in place formal policies or protections, either for displaced people or receiving communities. So this is going to be a very big challenge for the region, and it already is. And there are many solutions that lay around traditional systems of peace and security in the region that are working well, and these are starting to be documented, but there's still a long way to go to pull that into formal systems of decision making and other policy approaches as well. So turning to some of the solutions, without a doubt, stopping climate change has to be the paramount priority for our region. And this requires much greater ambition that's currently on the cards, and commitments to decarbonisation and net zero carbon by the middle of the century, by 2050. And coal needs to become an energy of the past. But regardless of what we do now, there will already be loss and damage, and we will require significant adaptation and resilience building, because we're already locked into a significant level of global warming, and it's only going to get worse in the short to medium term. So let me speak briefly on climate finance and how important this is to small island developing states in the region to at least have a chance of building a level of resilience. So some of our island nations have assessed the annual expenditure of a government on climate change around 20% of their national annual budget. Can you imagine having to spend 20% of your GDP on an issue that you have not created? And when they seek climate finance to address these challenges, they have to develop complex project proposals, collect copious amounts of data, which they don't have, and they have to attract interlocutors who are willing to work in small countries on small projects, which is very unattractive. The region is a very expensive place to operate in, and the transaction costs and administrative oversight is very high. And if they finally get the resources 3 to 5 years later, after their project concepts have been put together and the proposals have been approved, the limited capacity that was available in country to implement those has probably moved on, or the need has changed. And so this is a very painful and frustrating cycle for countries, and they've simply had enough of it. And we've run out of time. We need to move away from project-based intervention that is very timely and administratively challenging to tailored modalities of disbursement of climate finance directly into countries' own national systems and country systems, like budgetary support or trust funds that are designed around the capability of those own countries and communities to absorb those investments at a rate commensurate with their absorptive capacity. And finally, when we talk about capacity building, we have to move beyond just training. It has to be about capacity supplementation and retention for small countries, for these investments to be country driven, to work at all and to be sustainable. You simply cannot train 20 people to do the work of 50. And climate change and the people needed to address that in small countries is the first incremental cost of climate change. Climate finance should be used to ensure that we have sufficient people on the ground to understand it, plan for it and respond for it in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you, Coral. So many significant issues and challenges raised there in terms of climate change and the climate crisis, as it were, in the Pacific, but also some solutions. So thank you for that, Coral. Just moving on now, Ian, you're a former Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea and you've worked extensively in the region. Along with other work, you've written several pieces in The Conversation on the involvement of China in the Pacific. How have we been seeing geopolitical tensions playing out in the region, and could increased Australian involvement further aggravate China?
Yes, well, wouldn't it be good if China and the West could work together in partnership in support of the aspirations of the region? I'm actually somebody who believes that China actually has some things to offer the region, including its own highly successful development model. But the truth is that we do have geostrategic tensions playing out across the region. It's a reflection of some broader forces that are at play across the world. But sometimes I think it's overblown. I think it's a bit overblown in the Australian media narrative from time to time. The narrative goes like this. China is expanding its military involvement across the region with a view to establish naval bases, and its concessional finance to fragile countries will ultimately turn into debt traps for those countries. Now, there might well be some truth in that, but China has actually not been as active as some people think. That may be coming, but if you look at China's response during the pandemic era or the pandemic period, China's actually missed an opportunity to step forward with a significant contribution to the region. Its overall contribution to the Pacific, according to people who follow these things, is about half what one Australian company I know of has contributed to PNG alone in the course of the pandemic. It has been surprisingly ineffectual, frankly, in its approach to the region. I've rarely seen a Chinese organisation put in the real due diligence required in terms of managing stakeholders, from the landowner to the environmental group to the government official. Instead, there's an assumption that centralised control will work, that if you do a deal with the person at the top, everything else will follow. The Pacific doesn't work like that. I think the time may come when we need to take China much more seriously in the region. I don't want to play the issue down, but I do think that these things can be overblown and distort the narrative here in Australia. Australia has stepped up in recent years, and its democratic partners have done the same. As somebody who believes in Australia's engagement with the region, I think that's a great thing. But I think we'd be doing policymakers a bit of a disservice if we concluded that it was only about limiting the influence of China. I think there are people who actually feel the importance of doing it for other reasons. So look, I think there's a long way to go here, but I return to what I said at the very beginning of my response. Wouldn't it be great if we could find some ways to work together, because this must look pretty strange from the perspective of the countries in the region itself.
Well, thank you for those insights, Ian. I think we might have some interesting questions coming through the chat box for later on. My next question, though, is about the link between tourism and development. Anne, you've previously been chair of Carnival Australia, a major cruise operator which helped generate significant tourism in the region. For some of these island states, tourism can have a huge impact on the local economy. But I'd also like to bring Coral into this and ask you both, at what cost can tourism be a sustainable way forward for development? And maybe if you could answer that first.
Yeah, I'm happy to start and Coral can follow. I think tourism should be part of a sustainable development strategy for what I'd call destinations, but for Pacific Island communities. And I have to say that the approach to expanding cruise into the region was very different in this part of the world than it's been in other parts of the world. It started with engagement with local communities, thinking about environmental mapping before ships came in, thinking about local job opportunities, and the sustainability, I guess, of the tourism offering. Because I think the notion that you bring Australians and New Zealanders to remote Pacific islands and you throw them onto a beach and hope everything will be all right is not a very good strategy from a tourism operator point of view, nor is it appropriate from a community point of view. So I think all tourism development now, if it's going to be sustainable, needs to have a very different mindset. It needs to be about community engagement. It needs to be about community benefit. It needs to have an eye on being able to measure environmental impact as well. And ultimately, in many of the remote communities that the Carnival took ships to, it was also in those communities about having jobs that could be housed in their communities, because they, like many remote communities all over the world, found themselves with the elderly and the young, because working age adults, if they wanted paid employment, had to leave to get jobs. And we wanted to give an opportunity for those jobs to be located back into communities as part of the sustainable strategy. So it's, these things, I guess, are measured by the demand. And what I always said to people is we'll be successful in broadening the reach of tourism into the parts of the Pacific that we did when those communities want us to come, rather than us turning up saying, we'll be good for you. Trust us, we'll be good for you. And in fact, of the 50 ports we opened in about 6 or 7 years, all happened because communities came and said, we want to work with you to try and bring some of that benefit to our community, whether that was in Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Tonga and the Solomon Islands, and Samoa. All of those communities, in fact, came to us. And we, in the end, developed a group of people from those communities who worked with each other across the Pacific to help other communities learn the lessons they had learned, not to necessarily make the mistakes that we made in the early days, to work with those communities on very simple things like managing a local market on a day a ship comes to town. Those sorts of skills weren't necessarily in abundance in the more remote communities that we visited. But I think tourism has been a very important part of the economic story in the Pacific, but it does need to be done sustainably. It does need to be to the benefit of communities, and it does need to be linked, I think, to other things communities needed. So as an example of that, companies like Carnival can use their power and connection into government, into aid agencies and into NGOs to bring other services sometimes to those communities who wouldn't get them any other way. So whether that's a local health clinic or a school or a preschool, and there was a lot of work done to build more infrastructure benefit as opposed to just tourism infrastructure into the communities we visited as well. So again, those communities felt as though there was more value to them than just some money being left on the table in those communities, that they had infrastructure that they may not have got any other way. So I do think the tourism story has to have a very, very strong shared value, sustainable component, or the communities rightly will say, we don't want you to come back.
Thank you, Anne. So you've touched on partnerships. We're going to come back to those shortly. But Coral, first I'd like to ask you now, do you think tourism is a sustainable way forward for development?
Yeah, but I think Anne's highlighted some really important opportunities and reasons why it is still and should be a very important part of this solutions going forward. But I think it's also important probably to acknowledge the real hit that the region has taken economically, and the Achilles tendon has really been tourism. The countries who have been really dependent on tourism have pretty much lost all of their incomes in a space of a very short period of time. So collectively, and even those exporting commodities like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, the stopping of and the decreased numbers of shipping and planes into the routes into the region, and the quadrupling of freight costs have really affected all those revenue options. And so within, the span of just over a year, the region's taken on an extra $1.6 billion in debt. And those debt levels are now exceeding levels that will affect their ability to recover in the short and medium term. And so, this means that the resources that should be invested in schools and education and healthcare, just to get people back up above the poverty line, is very, very low. And so there's a serious challenge that economic ministers and finance ministers and trade ministers are discussing this week actually in the region. And IMF suggested that tourism will not return to the region to pre-COVID levels anytime before 2023. So within this next couple of years, the countries are really squeezed for options. And they're going to have to diversify, and they are exploring those opportunities very quickly, along with options to reduce those debt levels. But despite that, I agree with Anne. I think in the long term, tourism is still a very important option for the region. It has to be done in a way that is sustainable, where you can spread that dollar across the community, and that it's respectful of the cultures in the region. As well. I think there's a type of tourist that we need in the Pacific, and that's those who are willing to pay a bit more to support a unique experience and to contribute to the ecosystems in the region and the societies in Pacific Island countries. We need to really avoid the noodle brigade, those tourists that pack their own noodles, Weet-Bix and Vegemite, to have a cheap holiday. There's many other destinations in the world where that's probably appropriate. I don't think the Pacific's one of them, and certainly not at this moment. My own country is still holding fast on the investment in sustainable tourism strategy built around ocean conservation integrity, that ecotourism, dark skies, and that cultural experience. And I think that that's ultimately the only type of tourism that is sustainable in some of the small countries like mine. Our objective is not to increase the numbers here, it's just to increase the value that's retained in the country based on a different type of tourism experience. And completely anecdotal, of course, and biased from my side, but I think ecotourism and escaping to a little island that possibly has been COVID-free is probably going to be reasonably attractive once people can start travelling again, hopefully. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Coral and Anne, for those interesting points, but also the information that you've shared with us all this evening. Now, with all that we've discussed so far in mind, I'd like to ask all of you, including Debbie, are we seeing a shift in Australia's attitude towards the Pacific? And how do we change our mindset to see the Pacific Island countries more as partners rather than simply as a region that we support through foreign aid? Oh, Ian, maybe we'll start with you, please.
Sure, Anita, thank you. Look, it's a really important question. I'm sure that the countries of the region don't define themselves as aid recipients, and nor should we think about them that way. We often get a little bit carried away when we think about our aid program anyway. If you take the Papua New Guinea example, which is one I know well, $500 million aid program sounds a lot, I'm sure, from an Australian taxpayer point of view, but even in these difficult days for Papua New Guinea's own national revenue is more than 10 times that. We're not quite as big a player in the economies of the region as we sometimes think we are through our aid efforts. And in any case, successful engagement in this region and anywhere else, in my view, does not rest on the amount of money you put into an aid program. It rests instead on relationship, and relationship, of course, rests on respect. And the best way of showing respect in the Pacific is getting behind the region's own aspirations, including to sustainably develop its own industries, be it communications, fisheries, mining, tourism. Australia does have an agreement along with New Zealand with the region called PACER Plus, and in a way that's a useful model because it does treat the region as partners rather than supplicants, and it also seeks to encourage the region's active engagement in global trade. That's the way of the future. I think there needs to be more of that.
Thank you. Anne, can we throw to you now, please?
Yeah, look, I think the mindset shift needs to be predicated on a couple of things. One is not adopting our sort of Fortress Australia mentality, but thinking of ourselves as part of a Pacific community that needs to work together and hang together to ensure that the region is sustainable, that we still have the most amazing places to visit, that we still have fish to be caught, that we still have reefs that people want to visit from all over the world. All of those things that really do make us a unique part of the world. And I just think we need to think about ourselves as part of a wider community to do that. I think the second piece of it is the value of the cultural heritage and the cultural integrity of so many of our Pacific countries. And I often hear people talk about, I'm going to travel to somewhere a long way away where there's a tiny group of people left who are the original Indigenous community for a cultural experience. And I'm thinking, you could just go down the road, really, to any of our Pacific neighbours, and you can find cultural integrity in ways that is almost impossible to find in virtually any other part of the world. And we sort of take it for granted without understanding the value of that and really valuing it. And it partly goes to Coral's point about tourists who are interested in that sort of cultural content and heritage. It's just in spades all around us, and yet we don't think of it in the way I think we should. So there's a mindset shift we need to get about that. I think there's an economic mindset shift as well, because ultimately our economic prosperity in our entire region is going to be founded on a climate, an understanding and an action plan around climate. Because so much of our future here, New Zealand and our near neighbours, if the sea levels start rising, we are collectively at risk. And so we've got a common enemy, I think, we need to band together to address, and that's the issue of global warming and climate. And it's impacting on us in slightly different ways, but actually the collective impact is going to be very significant if we don't face into it. And then finally, I just wanted to make a comment on the China-Australia sort of global security issue. I think I agree with Ian that we should imagine if we saw ourselves working together, because we do operate very differently in the region. The Chinese are very pragmatic in the region. They often come in and fix something that's needed to be fixed for a long time. And the Australian aid programs tend to be different to that, tend to be about longer term sustainability, education, health, a lot of the, I guess, some of the core issues in the fabric of many of the communities. But collectively, in terms of aid, it's not something we should be thinking about doing to the Pacific. It's something we should be working with the Pacific, because it's to our collective benefit that those issues are addressed, that the infrastructure challenges are addressed, that the health and community outcomes, the sustainability goals are met in the Pacific. That's to our collective benefit, and working together with those communities and with the governments in the Pacific to make that happen should be absolutely a collective effort, because we're going to fail globally on the SDGs if the Pacific doesn't meet its targets.
Mm. It's a great segue, thank you, Anne, into hearing from Coral right now on your thoughts.
No, thank you. I agree with all those great points that Anne and Ian have raised. The relationship with Australia has progressed and evolved significantly over the years to one of partnership, far more than an aid and recipients. And that's evident in the presence of Australian missions in most, if not all, of the Pacific countries. Now that relationship, that close relationship and understanding is critical, and it highlights the issue that Ian raised around the importance of that continued relationship into the future. And island nations are far more mature in self-governance and experience now. They assert themselves very strongly around positions of sovereignty and self-determination. And collectively they are a force to reckon with in the UN. They've got a number of votes, and they support Australia where Australia is seeking support, and vice versa. So there's a lot of mutual benefits to that relationship already. But governments are not the only voices, as was highlighted in some of our discussions. Academic institutions shaping the new minds of the world are really important to helping steer public and professional opinion around the importance of the region. Please teach more and help Pacific students contribute to your learnings. At the same time, I'm one of those Pacific people who have benefited from, coming through the UQ. The region is currently going through the development of a 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. And this is happening right now, and this is a really important process for Australians to engage in as well. The region's never faced a scenario where we are literally trying to strategically plan across into the future, across a time frame that will include multiple tipping points of our planet's stability, and which could mean a significant detriment to many of our countries. That's not an easy scenario to develop, and this has been a massive undertaking in the region. And it really requires meaningful engagement of all voices, in particular the youth, given it's their future that we're planning for, and we're really making many assumptions about the future that they want rather than actually engaging them in that consultation. And my children will have much more in common with your children than we have with each other and our grandparents had with each other. That level of unity amongst young people globally, I think, is a force to reckon with, and it's really the saving grace to get us off this global consumption merry-go-round that we're on at the moment, and which ultimately underpins the challenges that we're facing right now with climate change and others. And there's much beauty and resilience in the Pacific cultures and traditional ways of knowing and doing, and I think that it's really important that we don't lose that Indigenous science, because it's absolutely critical and complements the many gaps that we have in formal science to help us all make much better decisions as we go forward. And ultimately, I think these are the fabrics that will bring us closer together if we learn about them and embrace them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coral, for that. And I'll throw to Debbie now, please.
Thank you, Anita. And before I respond, can I just thank all members of our panel for me having the privilege of listening to people with such expertise about the region, to hear from you, Coral. I'm sure all of our alumni who are joining us today will be deeply appreciative of all that you're doing, but all that you've contributed to this event. I think on the particular question, yes, the mindset absolutely has to shift. I think the mindset is shifting, but there's a lot of further room, and we've got to move beyond thinking about the Pacific through the lens of aid and through the lens of development. And I think that's been a theme, obviously, right through this discussion. We all know that people-to-people links, genuine partnership, genuine collaboration are what builds those mutually beneficial relationships that are of benefit both to Pacific nations but also to Australia, and they are what are absolutely critical to our shared future. And I think, Anne, we've heard that a lot from you, our collective future. That is critically important, and there's so many areas of intersection in business, in tourism, in culture, in the arts, and there is much more that we need to do to build those deep people-to-people links and that deep understanding and trust broadly across the region. And I think, as you've said, Coral, education is a very important pillar of how we need to build that trust and understanding. And I can assure you, at the University of Queensland, we're very committed to what we can continue to do in our educational pursuits. But I think in terms of shifting the mindset, it's what has been just the most sobering theme through this whole discussion. We have a shared responsibility. This region, as we've heard so eloquently from Coral, is facing already the impact of climate change. The mindset will change because we have a shared responsibility to work with the region to do what we can to address this situation. We have to show regional leadership. We can only show regional leadership in partnership, and that is absolutely what we all need to do, and we need to do it on the global stage, because the world will be watching us in terms of what we can do together to help mitigate the impacts of climate change, which, as I say, are already starting to have impact on the Pacific region. They will affect us, and they will affect future generations. And that is, I think, increasingly what is going to change that mindset. It needs to. We need to work together to really ensure we have an impact and that we demonstrate shared regional leadership, because we've got a responsibility to do it.
Thank you, Debbie, and to the whole panel. So much food for thought there, not only for those who are watching this evening, but for those who will watch this conversation in the weeks and months and years to come. Unfortunately, we've only got time for one audience question tonight, but I want to thank everyone for sending those through. We will be hosting a roundtable discussion with a UQ expert in the coming weeks, so do stay tuned for that. Our question is from Noah this evening, and Noah asks, do you think that Australia's interest in the Pacific region is too focused on its strategic importance, which is reducing its capacity to effectively engage and support real positive impact? Ian and Anne, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I completely agree that if Australia behaves in a way towards the region that suggests that it's only on about its own interests, that will very quickly undermine our partnership with the Pacific. But there's a deeper truth, and that is, as I think we've all been saying in our own way, that the interests of the Pacific and the interests of Australia are indivisible. The prosperity, the security, the stability of this region is in our interests too. Now, I'm a former foreign affairs guy, so I think in terms of interests, but let me also say, based on a lifetime of engagement with the Pacific, that to suggest that our engagement with this region is only based on some kind of assessment of interests actually misunderstands the deep depth and the warmth of the web of personal linkages that exist across the Pacific, including to Australia. It's a fundamental platform which is to the greater good of the region, in my view.
Thank you. And Anne?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Sometimes I think the slight competitive tension actually keeps Australia on its toes. As we slash our foreign budgets or our not just our aid budgets, but our investment budgets offshore, having China dance around the region sometimes helps to refocus that. But I think in the long term, it's not going to be about it shouldn't be about the competition. It shouldn't just be about us, if you like, protecting our vested interests. The relationship should be about the long-term sustainability of the Pacific region, of which we are a key part. And unless we start talking about it, thinking about it like that, including inside government, then we're easily picked off as opportunistic and fronting up against China, which I don't think is the primary motivation, but it probably makes for a better news story at the moment.
Thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. I'd like to thank Debbie, Ian, Coral and Anne for their time, as well as you, our amazing alumni from around the world, for sending in your questions and joining us to learn from some of the incredible change makers in our community. We will be in touch shortly with some further resources from our conversation tonight, including a complimentary piece from our panellists, as well as an opportunity to participate in an upcoming roundtable discussion, information on the UQ South Pacific Islander Association Scholarship Initiative and more. Thank you again for joining us tonight, or perhaps it's the morning, wherever you are in the world. Take care.
Thank you.